Hey Josh, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, doing well. Well, thank you for coming on Design Dish today. We have a couple categories of questions for you to answer today from the perspective of the food service industry. We're going to start off with some strategy and industry thinking questions. We're going to go into innovation and future outlook. And then after that, we'll go into philosophy and leadership perspective. And of course, finish up with our trademark question, why Ricca? So let's get started. Are you ready?
Let's do it. Fire away.
Awesome. Where do you see the biggest disconnect between how operators want to work and how spaces are currently being designed?
Well, I think that there are a couple of different perspectives in the operator side. There are owners who want to push revenue, and that's understandable. And then there are the folks that are, you know, for example, working in the kitchens who have a different perspective. They live in different worlds. And I think that from a culinary standpoint, we often see lengthy wish lists and interest in certain technologies or equipment that may not be in line with budgets or broader operational goals.
So, how do you work to combine those two and make sure the owner and the kitchen staff are happy in the
So I
design?
think that's right at the core of what we do as consultants, to bridge the gap between different partners and stakeholders in a project. We need to understand what everyone's motivations are so we can be an advocate for our client, who we work for, but on behalf of the people that are working in these facilities. So, you know, being able to understand the important goals, the things that are most essential to the culinary team, and respect the budget, the project schedule, the impact to the rest of the design partners and engineers. That's where our role really lives fundamentally.
It's really being able to bridge the gap between all of the different motivations and goals and simplify it into one solution.
Yeah, and there's not always a clean answer. Like any relationship, there's compromise, and oftentimes the culinary team, boots on the ground, may have to sacrifice something for
Mm.
the betterment of the project or the feasibility of building a project. And there's a lot of different tools we can implement to smooth that over, to perhaps future proof something, or put something off for a day two
Mhm.
installation. So, for example, if somebody wants a really expensive copy oven, and they don't have money in the budget for that, we can often put in the utility infrastructure to support that unit during the construction. And then once there's proof of concept and there's revenue flowing, that owner could opt to purchase that unit, and everything's
Oh,
already there.
interesting. So, do you, when you're designing, do you leave that space empty or do you put in a lower grade model for the time being with the assumption that they'll get the budget for the expensive combi down the line? Or
Yeah, it could be both. Sometimes if there's ample space, we may leave an opening or parking spot. Sometimes you may specify a less sophisticated piece of equipment, like a convection oven, which you could swap out and put in a combi oven.
gotcha. If you could reset one long-standing industry norm from scratch, what would it be and why?
Well, I think that one category that is often standardized in some ways, is around bar design. It seems that there is a lot of different ways to approach bar design, and if you look at, Europe, for example, they've adopted um, very different approaches with ergonomics in mind and
Also,
what's more functional. The way that in the U.S., the way that we tend to design bars is very much about speed and volume. The trend for some time now, probably a decade or more, has been towards more mixology focused cocktails.
Mm,
And granted, there's no, one size fits all for bar design. It really
of
depends on the
course.
the beverage program and what they're trying to do. But in an environment where they are trying to make more elevated cocktails, having the appropriate equipment is important. And so when I talk about ergonomics, the methods of assembling a cocktail are are much different than pouring your typical one-to-one drink, vodka soda, rum and coke, things like that, where it really is about speed and volume. But the trend towards mixology, I don't think we can call it a trend anymore, but there are a lot of solutions out there, and I feel like from an ownership level, they don't always understand the need to spend a little more money in that category.
Mm,
So oftentimes, we're the operators are left with sort of the common denominator of your standard bar equipment. And then they suffer operationally. And what the often ownership doesn't realize is that's hurting their bottom line, from a guest experience perspective, as well as quality control and efficiency. There's a lot of time lost when bars are designed inefficiently.
So, what are you seeing in Europe that you like?
So it's not just in Europe, but it's
Mm,
design trends that have been adopted by some manufacturers in our industry, and there are um, different product lines that are being offered where they're they're more focused around the assembly of a cocktail. The kind of standard American cocktail station is all centered around an ice bin and building a cocktail directly above an ice bin. Well, that's great when you have two ingredients, but when you have multiple ingredients and you're really trying to present the craft of putting together a cocktail, you really want to elevate that. So a lot of these lines of equipment are centered around a higher elevation of equipment. So instead of your typical lower equipment, it's raised 4 to 6 inches, and then there's a larger variety of accessory equipment that supports that. So rinsers and condiments and tinctures and different tools and things like that. And it's not just cocktail shaker, ice scoop, liquor mixer.
gotcha. Well, I think that efficiency, and have you heard from feedback from the operator, the mixologist, bartender, that 4 to 6 inches really does make a difference at the end of the day?
It does make a huge difference. And I have heard from mixology experts that it's a big deal. And many of them, like the leaders in that field, have sort of hacked the system on their own already
Mm,
and have taken buyout components from different bar manufacturers and assembled them in such a way to suit their needs. It's just that now many of those manufacturers are actually offering lines of equipment that are directly, answering those needs. So yeah, it does make a difference. If you think about ergonomics, like if you're building a cocktail on a bar top, there's a reach involved. And so bartender standing there building a cocktail that takes 20, 30 seconds, a minute to put together is now leaning over that distance towards the guest, which that's a strain over the shift of a for a bartender. So that's a small thing maybe to us, but for somebody that works in a bar 4 or 5 nights a week, that
they're putting
that
in those
has a
reps.
toll. Yeah, it
Yeah.
takes its toll. And ergonomics, in terms of taking steps, having everything you need within arm's reach, that's huge.
Mm.
Organization, that's what it's all about in the bar.
Yeah. Now manufacturers are providing those options for organization rather than the bartenders going in and crafting it or making it themselves.
Right.
On the topic of trends, what trend do you feel is overemphasized at the moment? And what trend do you think is not getting enough attention?
we talk about sustainability a lot, and you know, this is maybe not a widely accepted view, but I believe that the trend towards electrification in the U.S. specifically um, is not the solution that everybody thinks it is. The reality is that in our country, we still burn fossil fuel for 80% of our electricity. So there is a significant misconception that, creating an all electric kitchen is significantly reducing carbon footprint.
Yeah.
Um, so I feel that this is, been heavily marketed and promoted. And while there may be some reduction in local carbon footprint from a broader macro view, that may not be the case. In addition, the impact that electrification in the commercial kitchen world has on the grid at large is significant. So as we see this trend proliferate in major city centers, that's going to be a significant problem, and it's going to be a limiting factor to passing legislation that promotes electrification as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I've always had that thought process when we talk about all electric kitchens that I'm like, the energy's still coming from somewhere. It's still
Right.
coming from the coal that's getting burned to produce the electricity. And so, how does that work long term in terms of sustainability? And I think it's important that you bring that up, and it's a good topic.
Yeah, I mean, what that is, it's really it's a band-aid. It's a PR campaign. But if somebody wants to pursue electrification in a more holistic strategy, that's a different story. If you're going to commit to sourcing your energy from a sustainable source, if you produce more energy in your own facility through solar or other means, that's a different story. But
Yeah.
in a conventional power grid setup, it's just not what I think people think that it is.
So now moving on to innovation and future outlook. How do you think technology will reshape the role of the food service designer over the next decade?
Well, this is a good one, and I know you are very personally close to this topic, so that's great. I mean, I think that it is very fluid right now.
Agreed.
Not just in our food service industry, but in the world at large. I think that every industry is trying to grasp their crystal ball and see into the future and what technology and AI and automation, robotics, all these things will do to their industry, their careers, their businesses. I think in the food service landscape, there's a number of different areas that are of interest. From an equipment standpoint, there is the sort of Internet of Things that is becoming commonplace, where every device, every piece of equipment is a smart device. It provides some sort of data to be analyzed, and that's all well and good. Of course, just like anything else, more data sometimes is more data, and if
That's
it
what I was
can't
going to
be
say.
if it can't be organized and analyzed in a thoughtful way, then it's just that. It's just noise. There's there's a lot of AI and other technology related to operations and POS and inventory and staff management, HR, things like that, which I don't think we need to touch on. But more on the equipment side, there's also robotics and automation, and I think
How
that
often are you seeing robotics and automation implemented day to day? Do you see a market trend where that's more prevalent?
Yes and no. I think it's more common where the level of food or beverage that's being served is less sophisticated and requires less of a human touch or nuance in preparation. So you're not going to see automation in a fine dining kitchen at this stage. But in a grab and go environment, a cafeteria environment, an airport, things like that, there's certainly a place for it. But the form the form that automation takes in the food service equipment world is really all over the map right now. We still have a lot of solutions being put out there that are robotics that emulate the human form. And by that, I mean they are augmenting the process of using equipment that is designed for humans by way of some sort of robotic arm.
They're
Um,
mixing, they're flipping, they're
yeah, there's a good example is automated fryer system where it's still a traditional fryer setup, but instead of a human lifting the basket out, dropping the fries, it's a robot doing it.
oh,
Um,
interesting.
there are bartender robots and sushi robots and things like that, many of which again are using like a robotic arm, which imitates human form. But much like other industries, like you look at automated autonomous cars, like a Waymo, they're still the cars themselves are still cars that are designed to be driven by a human that have been augmented to be driven by an AI.
It's not fundamentally changing, it's just augmenting currents.
Right. So I think that we're starting to see a little bit of a shift with some particular equipment that is removing the traditional human form factor and kind of reevaluating what it means. So like, the burger making machine is more of an assembly line. It's more of a manufacturing process and less of this is a robot that looks like a human that's making a cheeseburger, right? So I feel like that is probably more the trend is to retool the processes to their fundamental efficiency. Much like I think what's going to happen with the autonomous cars is there won't be a steering wheel and forward facing seats anymore because you don't need to look at the road and nobody ever needs to get behind the wheel and drive the car. We could all be facing each other. I think similarly with equipment, it won't be designed to sometimes be operated by a human and sometimes be operated by a machine.
It's going to be solely autonomous. And like the car reference, I mean, maybe it doesn't look, maybe the aerodynamics can change so drastically that the car that was designed in the 1920s can now, or it does not resemble what that looks like.
Yeah, and I just don't think
Maybe
we haven't hit that sort of pivotal point yet where enough of the equipment within a collection of equipment in a kitchen can be autonomous and work together. So right now you have sort of this piecemeal of components. It's just a matter of time to where we hit that critical mass and kind of turn the corner. And like the car thing, it's like the whole steering wheel aspect is a remnant of driving a horse-drawn carriage. You're sitting there, you're steering something. Okay, well that makes sense. As they design a car, you're going to sit there, you need to look at where you're going, you're going to steer something, you're mechanically at the wheels with the steering wheel. As those things get removed, you don't need to design it for the same function.
I'm kind of imagining the back of a limousine, but a four-person.
Exactly. It's just a capsule rolling down the road.
I think it'll be really interesting as those autonomous robotic, kitchen helpers, what they are now, as they start to be able to work together, how that will affect the design of the kitchen, the space needs of the operation.
It'll change dramatically. Right now there's a lot of space in a kitchen that is solely for the circulation of people.
Yep.
The support of people, restrooms, offices, locker rooms, circulation paths, egress paths, stairs. There's a lot of space that can be removed if it's comprehensively automated.
Yeah. I think I mean, to wrap this up, but I think at the end of the day, the end user, the person who's purchasing the food, do you think their experience is going to be at the detriment to the growth of autonomous robots in the kitchen?
I think it's still going to be nuanced, and like any technology, it's a tool, it's a means to an end. And for a Michelin star chef, what level of automation would they be comfortable introducing into their process? Is it going to be an entirely autonomous kitchen? Probably not. But are there tools within that space that they could lean into technology for? Probably. I think it sort of remains to be seen how sophisticated some of these components become. But at the end of the day, there's a human element to food. The consumption of food, the crafting of food, the storytelling. There's a very intrinsic human element, the empathetic connection to where food is from and the craft with which it's prepared for you. So I don't
And when
think
it's made with
that.
love.
Yeah, exactly. And those are things that AI cannot emulate.
Totally.
So
When people say future ready design, what does that actually mean beyond flexibility as a buzzword?
well, flexibility is probably the number one component. I think that it probably, unfortunately, mostly means making things generic in a way, where they can be modified at a reduced cost in the future.
Talking about leaving that open space for a combi.
Leaving open space or over-engineering the services that are available, like locally to a space. So, for example, we talk about electrification, right?
Mm-hmm.
It could mean right now you're using mixed fuel, gas, and electric in a kitchen, but you're building in conduits to bring in larger circuits of power for a future electrification project. So something like that might be future proofing. There's another element of future proofing where people think they're going to forecast and predict where these trends are headed. I think some of that is valid and relevant, and we certainly talk about that a lot when we're working on large scale and long timeline projects where design is happening now for something that may not be built for 4, 5, 6 years down the road. Things change fast. Technology changes fast. So trying to predict not only technology and innovation, but also human behavior from the patron guest perspective. So those are very relevant, and at the end of the day, it's still a guessing game, right? You can only do so much, and that's where the kind of keeping things flexible in some ways is the best thing you can do. Now, that being said, a lot of food service facilities have high turnover. A lot of these spaces are used heavily. They're burned fast and hard, and they can require replacement and renovation within just a couple of years sometimes. So that does give us the opportunity to not worry so much about predicting the future. But that's where that future proofing, thinking about, something might need to be replaced. How can we make that process in the future as painless as possible?
On that, I was going to say, how do you go about predicting the needs of a space that's not going to be built for 5 to 6 years, 4 to 5? How do you think about design in a different way?
I mean, a lot of that has to do with benchmarking in the past and, looking at what, at this moment in time, this is what we know about this concept, this industry, whatever it is. And then you try to layer in what the aspirations of the client are. What does this owner want to do? What are their goals? If they want to lean really heavy towards innovation and technology, well, then you're going to have to probably take some more risks and introduce ideas that are not vetted, which can be fun. That's kind of an
Interesting. Yeah.
exploratory process. And as long as everyone's on the same page that, there's no guarantees, it could be great. Some clients want to be much more conservative and lean into the tried and true, but understand that it does evolve. So that's where you probably end up in the more generic future proofing category of making things flexible, over engineering for future changes.
Now, moving into a little bit more of the philosophy and your leadership perspective, what separates a technically successful kitchen from one that truly creates a memorable experience?
Well, it's always about people. I've seen amazing chefs that just simply can't lead people, and they end up in a very dysfunctional and toxic environment, and those concepts often don't succeed.
Even if it was designed perfectly to the T, efficiency wise, circulation wise, it's the people.
It's yes. And conversely, you can have a horribly designed facility with a great team and see success. So, as much as we as food service consultants would love to, take responsibility for the success of all of our clients, I don't think that is ultimately the case. I think that we try to set them up for success as best we can to remove obstacles from their goals in the kitchen. But at the end of the day, those teams are the ones that need to operate and connect with their guests. And so, that I think the human element there is paramount. And, I love the book by Will Guidara that, talks a lot about team building and the teamwork, team dynamics in the kitchen, and his experience with 11 Madison Park. And it just goes to show you how much they go above and beyond. And, I think in the food world, that human connection, and like in his book, which is called Unreasonable, by the way, that escaped me for a second.
Thank you.
Going above and beyond, and the real core concept of hospitality, of caring for the guest. And even as that translates into business as well, taking a hospitality approach to business, as a consultant, trying to go above and beyond to anticipate the needs of not only your client, but of your partners in the design process and engineers, to communicate well, to be vulnerable, to try to offer value wherever you can. Those are fundamental parts of business, and of course, within the kitchen environment as well.
I have two more questions for you before we wrap up today. First being, what mindset shift do emerging designers need if they want to lead in the next era of the industry?
Well, I think that it goes without saying that being an early adopter to AI is really critical. I know we are trying to do that. I know many of our contemporaries are on that path as well. And as I said before, AI will be a tool, be a part of business, and I think trying to think that AI is somehow a trend that's going to go away is naive. I mean, now how that's implemented is, I think, remains to be seen, but I think it will be rather vast. But there are still a huge amount of human functions within the consulting world that will require human touch. There is an enormous amount of nuance in the construction of the built environment, especially in specialty industries like food service equipment. So understanding the dynamics between different teams and trying to get to the crux of somebody's goals and intentions, to weigh the pros and cons of different initiatives and goals that a project might have, whether it's budget, sustainability, um, all of those things are still very human focused. In addition to, to be, I forget the exact words of your question, but a successful consultant in the future,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think taking a very multidisciplinary approach and understanding what each player on a team is doing is really critical. And I try with our people to help them understand that nothing is black and white when it comes to all these people on this boat trying to row in the same direction. It seems like it should be easy, but schedules are can often be fluid. Deliverables can often be misunderstood or can be negotiated because you haven't really gotten to the true intent of a particular milestone. So that multidisciplinary approach is really huge, and having experience with in different arenas is helpful. Like, I think a lot of folks in the food service consulting world have some experience in the restaurant industry, growing up, waiting tables, delivering pizzas, washing dishes, bartending in college, whatever it might be. Those are great experiences, and those can be the foundation of how some of those people got into this. But then, in addition, having some interest in architecture and um, probably the least understood element, unfortunately, is the construction industry. I think that's one where there seems to be sometimes a disconnect between what we do and really understanding the gravity of the entire project. I think that, I think sometimes because we live in this food service equipment world, we put our blinders on and we sometimes fail to appreciate how complicated the the assembly of not only all these disciplines and trades, um, but the schedules that go with it, the cost tied to the entire project. So I think from a construction standpoint, having those skills and understanding can be really helpful.
I guess besides experience, and you just talked about working in kitchens, being a bartender, besides experience, how do you recommend one expands their understanding of the entire team to be able to better grasp their goals and motivations?
Well, I think everyone trying to find a shortcut to experience, which is tough. I think at that point, it's really about trying to increase the quality of the experience that you get. We can't fast forward time, but if you spend that time gathering quality experience versus the person next to you on the same career path who's spending their time less quality experience, you will
Maybe on
excel.
autopilot.
Yeah. So I think seeking alignment and shadowing and mentorship with other more experienced people is probably the easiest way to do that. And, taking on challenges, I think, some of this seems really cliche, but like
Hmm.
taking risk and not being afraid to fail, that's easy to say, harder to do. But it's important to kind of trip over your own feet a little bit when you're coming up. And I know for me, when I was younger, I had sort of a kind of almost undeserved confidence, and that served me well, and it allowed me to speak up in rooms where I probably nobody wanted to hear my voice, but I was able to accelerate my experience in some ways with that. So having that sort of blind confidence, I think, is important because especially when you're, earlier in your career, you really you really are insulated in a lot of ways, and there isn't a huge amount of liability and risk because you have people above you that are helping to make sure that things get fixed, that course is corrected, and the ultimate liability lies on your managers, if you will.
Okay, Josh, for our final question, I asked all of the principals this. I want to know why Ricca and what does creating what's next mean to you?
Well, this is a good one for me because I've been with Ricca for a little over a year now, and coming off a long career with another consulting firm, I chose Ricca in the end. So for me, Ricca has always been somewhat of a beacon in the industry. Not only the legacy of Tom Ricca and having over 50 years in operation in the industry, you hear consistently about being really solid consultants. And what I mean by that is, there's a reputation for doing things on time, on budget, being able to handle the curveballs that really large scale and high profile projects throw at you, throw at us. Those are things that, I talk to our potential clients about because, the larger the project, the larger the stakes, the it, you know the more intense the pressure cooker can be. So having the firepower that we have and the experience that we have collectively is a pretty much one of a kind resource in this industry. So that's a big part of it for me. And beyond that, because Ricca is so diversified in terms of different project types that we work on. I mentioned the high profile stuff, the large scale, but we do a lot of small projects as well. And, we do things in hospitality, we do things in healthcare, higher ed, stadiums and airports, country clubs, casinos, that vast experience and understanding how all of those things are different is really becomes a powerful perspective to bring to any one of those potential projects.
It broadens the opportunity for meaningful experiences that, like you said, build upon the future leaders.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a lot of what we offer to our clients. The value that we bring is that brain trust, that diverse background and project experience. So whatever the challenge is that a client may present, we have a whole arsenal of different solutions, different technologies, different equipment, different manufacturers, and different ways to approach coordination with different disciplines. There's it's pretty robust and sometimes not sometimes often humbling. It's not hard to go out there and tell people why Ricca because it speaks for itself in a lot of ways.
What does creating what's next mean to you?
Well, a lot about what I talked about in terms of what would make a great future leader consultant is being a proactive partner in the design.
Gonna get that on a t-shirt.
Yeah. Okay. I think that oftentimes people hire consultants, and those consultants end up just being an echo chamber for the client or for the chef or whatever, instead of challenging, instead of introducing new ideas or disrupting the status quo when there may be a better thing out there, a better widget. So I think being proactive about that is really important. And some of that takes courage. We talk about that a lot at Ricca is, be courageous, and, everybody's got your back. And I think the really special part is knowing when and where and how much gravity to put into those different ideas is really important. And that does take some experience. I think it comes to some people more naturally, but being able to read the room and know where there may be an opportunity to kind of push the boundaries a little bit, to do something exciting that really does bring value to the project and then ultimately to that owner's guests and patrons. I think that's fun. That's where the magic is.
Awesome. Well, it's been a great conversation with you today, Josh. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye.
All right.